Chapter 14 of the Circular Staircase. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Winna Hathaway. The Circular Staircase by Mary Roberts Rinehart. Chapter 14. An Eggnog and a Telegram. We had discovered Louise at the lodge Tuesday night. It was Wednesday I had my interview with her. Thursday and Friday were uneventful save as they marked improvement in our patient. Gertrude spent almost all the time with her, and the two had grown to be great friends. But certain things hung over me constantly. The coroner's inquest on the death of Arnold Armstrong, to be held Saturday, and the arrival of Mrs. Armstrong and young Dr. Walker bringing the body of the dead president of the Traders' Bank. We had not told Louise of either death. Then, too, I was anxious about the children. With their mother's inheritance swept away in the wreck of the bank, and with their love affairs in a disastrous condition, things could scarcely be worse. Added to that, the cook and Liddy had the flare-up over the proper way to make beef tea for Louise, and, of course, the cook left. Mrs. Watson had been glad enough, I think, to turn Louise over to our care, and Thomas went upstairs night and morning to greet his young mistress from the doorway. Poor Thomas! He had the faculty, found still in some old negroes who cling to the traditions of slavery days, of making his employer's interest his. It was always "we" with Thomas. I miss him sorely. Pipe-smoking, obsequious, not over-reliable, kindly old man. On Thursday, Mr. Harton, the Armstrongs' legal adviser, called up from town. He had been advised, he said, that Mrs. Armstrong was coming east with her husband's body and would arrive Monday. He came with some hesitation, he went on, to the fact that he had been further instructed to ask me to relinquish my lease on Sunnyside, as it was Mrs. Armstrong's desire to come directly there. I was aghast. "Here," I said. "Surely you are mistaken, Mr. Harton. I would think, after what happened here only a few days ago, she would never wish to come back." "Nevertheless," he replied, "she is most anxious to come. This is what she says: use every possible means to have Sunnyside vacated. Must go there at once." "Mr. Harton," I said testily, "I am not going to do anything of the kind. I and mine have suffered enough at the hands of this family. I rented the house at an exorbitant figure, and I have moved out here for the summer. My city home is dismantled and in the hands of decorators. I have been here 1 week, during which I have not had a single night of uninterrupted sleep, and I intend to stay until I have recuperated. Moreover, if Mr. Armstrong died insolvent, as I believe was the case, his widow ought to be glad to be rid of so expensive a piece of property." The lawyer cleared his throat. "I am very sorry you have made this decision," he said, "Miss Innes. Mrs. Fitzhugh tells me Louise Armstrong is with you." "She is." "Has she been informed of this double bereavement?" "Not yet," I said. "She has been very ill. Perhaps tonight she can be told." "It is very sad, he said. "I have a telegram for her, Miss Innes. Shall I send it out?" "Better open it and read it to me," I suggested. "If it is important, that will save time." There was a pause while Mr. Harton opened the telegram. Then he read it slowly, judicially. "Watch for Nina Carrington. Home Monday. Signed F.L.W." I said. "Watch for Nina Carrington. Home Monday. Very well, Mr. Harton. I will tell her, but she is not in condition to watch for anyone." "Well, Miss Innes, if you decide to relinquish the lease, let me know," the lawyer said. "I shall not relinquish it," I replied, and I imagined his irritation from the way he hung up the receiver. I wrote the telegram down word for word, afraid to trust my memory, and decided to ask Dr. Stewart how soon Louise might be told the truth. The closing of the Traders' Bank I considered unnecessary for her to know, but the death of her stepfather and stepbrother must be broken to her soon, or she might hear it in some unexpected and shocking manner. Dr. Stewart came about 4 o'clock, bringing his leather satchel into the house with a great deal of care, and opening it at the foot of the stairs to show me a dozen big yellow eggs nesting among the bottles. "Real eggs," he said proudly. "None of your anemic store eggs, but the real thing. Some of them still warm. Fill them. Eggnog for Miss Louise." He was beaming with satisfaction, and before he left he insisted on going back to the pantry and making an eggnog with his own hands. Somehow, all the time he was doing it, I had a vision of Dr. Willoughby, my nerve specialist in the city, trying to make an eggnog. I wondered if he ever prescribed anything so plebeian and so delicious. And while Dr. Stewart whisked the eggs, he talked. "I said to Mrs. Stewart," he confided, a little red in the face from the exertion, "after I went home the other day, that you would think me an old gossip for saying what I did about Walker and Miss Louise." "Nothing of the sort," I protested. "The fact is," he went on, evidently justifying himself, "I got that piece of information just as we get a lot of things, through the kitchen end of the house. Young Walker's chauffeur—Walker's more fashionable than I am, and he goes around the country in a Stanhope car. Well, his chauffeur comes to see our servant girl, and he told her the whole thing. I thought it was probable, because Walker spent a lot of time up here last summer, when the family was here, and besides, Riggs, that's Walker's man, had a very pat little story about the doctor's building a house on this property, just at the foot of the hill. The sugar, please." The eggnog was finished. Drop by drop the liquor had cooked the egg, and now, with a final whisk, a last toss in the shaker, it was ready, a symphony in gold and white. The doctor sniffed it. "Real eggs, real milk, and a touch of real Kentucky whiskey," he said. He insisted on carrying it up himself, but at the foot of the stairs he paused. "Riggs said the plans were drawn for the house," he said, harking back to the old subject, "drawn by Houston in town. So I naturally believed him." When the doctor came down, I was ready with a question. "Doctor," I asked, "is there anyone in the neighborhood named Carrington, Nina Carrington?" "Carrington?" He wrinkled his forehead. "Carrington? No, I don't remember any such family. There used to be Covingtons down the creek." "The name was Carrington," I said, and the subject lapsed. Gertrude and Halsey went for a long walk that afternoon, and Louise slept. Time hung heavy on my hands, and I did as I had fallen into a habit of doing lately. I sat down and thought things over. One result of my meditations was that I got up suddenly and went to the telephone. I had taken the most intense dislike to this Dr. Walker, whom I had never seen, and who was being talked of in the countryside as the fiancé of Louise Armstrong. I knew Sam Houston well. There had been a time when Sam was a good deal younger than he is now, before he had married Anne Endicott, when I knew him even better. So now I felt no hesitation in calling him over the telephone. But when his office boy had given way to his confidential clerk, and that functionary had condescended to connect his employer's desk telephone, I was somewhat at a loss as to how to begin. "Why, how are you, Rachel?" Sam said sonorously. "Going to build that house at Rockview?" It was a 20-year-old joke of his. "Sometime, perhaps," I said. "Just now I want to ask you a question about something which is none of my business." "I see you haven't changed an iota in a quarter of a century, Rachel." This was intended to be another jest. "Ask ahead. Everything but my domestic affairs is at your service." "Try to be serious," I said, "and tell me this. Has your firm made any plans for a house recently for a Dr. Walker at Casanova?" "Yes, we have." "Where was it to be built? I have a reason for asking." "It was to be, I believe, on the Armstrong place. Mr. Armstrong himself consulted me, and the inference was, in fact, I'm quite certain, the house was to be occupied by Mr. Armstrong's daughter, who was engaged to marry Dr. Walker. When the architect had inquired of the different members of my family, and had finally rung off, I was certain of one thing. Louise Armstrong was in love with Halsey, and the man she was going to marry was Dr. Walker. Moreover, this decision was not new. Marriage had been contemplated for some time. There must certainly be some explanation. But what was it? That day I repeated to Louise the telegram Mr. Harton had opened. She seemed to understand, but an unhappier face I have never seen. She looked like a criminal whose reprieve is over, and the day of execution approaching. End of Chapter 14. Recording by Winna Hathaway in Fayetteville, North Carolina.